Transferable skills.
From Cackle Media, this is Transferable Skills. I'm Noah Mishkin, and today's guest is Keith Crawford, who shares his skills journey from live audio events into portfolio manager. I hope you enjoy. Keith, it's great to have you here on the show. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Noah. I appreciate it.
Disclaimer for the audience, your wife and I worked together for a number of years, and not only did I enjoy working alongside her and her friendship as well, I got the benefit of a +1. And so, Keith, it's great to have you on the show and to now focus on you. Tell us a little bit about your background professionally.
My career started at an area of passion. I think back to when I was an early teenager. A mentor of mine had taught me a little bit of audio engineering at the time. I fell in love with that. Ended up going to school here in Chicago at Columbia for audio. Worked all throughout college, and that was kind of the start of it. Still am very much an audio engineer in a lot of ways, but I've transferred quite a bit after that. I started after college working for a sound company, kind of like an AV provider for live events. They needed someone to manage their kind of day-to-day. And so I kind of jumped into that for a while, learned a ton about operations and logistics, people. So completely different than what I had done before.
What was it about audio engineering? I'll tell you from my perspective and experience is as a musician from the age of 14, 15 years old, at some point, I wanted to record something that I created. And back then it was a tape recorder, a little set top, and you put a tape in and you hit record. And then maybe if you were a little more sophisticated, you had 2 tape recorders and then you can figure out a way to bounce and loop and track until you get to the point where you realize that there are multi-track recorders out there that are affordable. But that was my entry into audio engineering from a consumer standpoint. What was yours?
Yeah. So there's a small music venue in the town I grew up in, which I started to hang out in. Before that, I'd grown up playing music. So I started playing saxophone probably around the age of like 7 or 8. Wanted to do something a little more fun, for that age, especially like a little bit more pop, rock, whatever. So I learned how to play the guitar and loved music, loved playing in really bad bands with friends. And so then this music venue popped up and I started hanging out and someone was like, hey, we need someone to and it was low level, like VFW Hall-esque spot,
Where did you grow up?
New Jersey. So like right outside of Philadelphia. So about like 15, 20 minutes outside of Philadelphia. So
do you still play saxophone?
I don't still play saxophone. I definitely still play guitar, bass. I'm still an audio engineer. I have a part-time job to do it, to keep it kind of fresh, to kind of stay on top of it and just enjoy it. But yeah.
If you're still practicing and working in part-time audio engineering as a means to either satiate your interests and hobby enthusiasts, but also to stay relevant in professional practice and best practices and new emerging technology, I'm curious if you're still in it, what things have changed from when you first got into audio engineering and where they're at today?
Yeah, so much. When I started, even the scale professionally during the years that I started, like everything was analog. All of your processing around like compressors, limiters, all those things were all outboard pieces of equipment. So the setup was huge and the limitations were intense. And so since now, when I think about the last 18 years of that transition, everything's digital, right?
Has there ever been in the history of recording music artists and the industry a period that has changed in such a short amount of time?
No.
Than the last 20 years?
When you think about it to like the early 20th century, there's probably a few decades there post World War II that really sped up, but no, nowhere near it. Digital consoles, then you think about computer-based systems like Waves and plugins, and even now, since the use of AI is so prevalent in audio plugins, like it's just insane what you can pull off with minimal input sources. So yeah, it's a world of difference. And I think it's actually wonderful though. I have a lot of friends who are younger than me, or maybe didn't have the start that I did, where all of their frame of reference is in digital audio. And I think it's helpful for me to understand, all of this is voltage and electricity and electrical currents. And I had to learn all that. I was forced to understand all these like mathematical equations to understand signal flow and physics. And for them, it's more so just a widget on a screen.
Yeah.
And so I think the base knowledge is like amazing. I'm glad I was in that transitional period.
It's much more accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
Even when I was young, a 4-track mixer, which was analog and about the size of a laptop, It was fairly accessible, and you could tinker around and learn how to use it. And that's fairly sophisticated, not that dissimilar at all to how a computer that was a fraction of the processing power of something that's in our pocket today was the size of a gymnasium in the 1950s, 60s. Now you see the same thing where not only do you not have the same need of external hardware devices to just produce something, it's all digital and in one unit. But the most important thing, besides for efficiency of space and economy of space, it's the accessibility. You can record a full song, and I'm not saying that it's going to be at studio production quality levels, but for what 99.99% of the population who are musicians who want to record something, what they want to produce, it doesn't have to be to that level. You can do it with your phone. You can literally direct input into your phone today, and that's your entire studio if you want.
It's one of those things where, to your point, like it's not 100% the quality that you'd want in something you play back and listen to and enjoy as a user, but the ability to demo your own music and learn from it and send it to people to say, a lot of people now were even professionally as artists in remote situations where band members are not close, where they're like, hey, I just sent you this guitar track. What do you think? It's just a demo. And it's like before you had to have like a Tascam tape recorder and then mail the tapes out, or you had to have like, GarageBand with a separate audio interface and everything that went along with that. It's amazing how far it's come.
My entry into podcasting, and before we jumped on and started recording this conversation, I was telling you about a new little passion project that I'm doing is replacing the batteries of my old iPods, kind of bringing them back to life. But this iPod, it's white, it's got the chrome back. There's something nostalgic about it to me, which is a funny thing to say about something that is post 2000 digital era, but it's nostalgic. Why? Because it's tied to a moment in my life where music was always so important and meaningful to me, but I could now walk around, abandon my Discman, where I had to choose which 12 songs do I want to listen to for the next few hours. I remember in college, I walked into my dormitory suite and the roommate that I had next door had an iPod, and I had never seen one before. I didn't know what it was. And it had just come out, and I looked at it, he explained what it was to me. The idea of having 20,000 songs in your pocket, it was innovation. That was a moment of discovery that was, dare I say, life-changing. It was amazing. Point of that is the early days of podcasting. It's called podcasts for a reason. It's because they originally were created for iPods. You can listen to a radio program, a show, a story, a narrative on your iPod while you walked around without having to be connected to a radio and on demand.
I remember when it first showed up, like podcasts on the iPod, thinking, what is this? No one's going to use it. Why are we listening to radio? And everyone I talked to agreed. They're like, what's a podcast? There's no way anyone's going to listen to a podcast. I was young enough to think that naively, I guess, but it's insane to see how full circle it's come, right?
And back to your point, and maybe our point of where the audio engineering and accessibility world has gotten to today, could I ever have been doing what you and I are doing right now in 1995, or at least easily? Maybe I could create it, but I couldn't distribute it.
Yeah. There'd be probably 2 to 3 more people involved in your process.
Somebody would have to believe in me.
Yeah.
In this case, for this show to just launch, I just had to believe in myself. That's all.
Yeah.
But back then, you needed a team of people that would sign on and believe in you and think that you have something enough to invest in producing what you have.
Yeah.
It's crazy. You started at Columbia College of Chicago, and I have a strong plug for that school because I attended Columbia College of Chicago for a year and a half before eventually moving to Boston for architecture school. And I have nothing but positive praise for the institution. I think it's one of the most incredible schools, at least in the Midwest, if you want to be any kind of creator.
Yeah.
They're very well known for their broadcast production. And obviously that's what you went there for. So I love that school. I think it's amazing. And I love meeting people who went there too, because I've never heard of anyone who went to the school and didn't feel like they got an incredible education. I love it.
I didn't know you went there. I mean, I think creative educations are kind of undervalued on the broad professional spectrum. So it's good to hear that you also had a great time. I loved it. I think I learned so much by just seeing other people create and get influenced and be themselves in a unique way. You just get exposed to so much so quickly. And you really get to see people through their art, which is it's like you're living 10 lives in one. Like you get to experience other people's lives through what they're doing in a college setting, which is normally pretty programmatic, right? You have a professor, they teach you something, you write an assignment, you're good. Whereas for art school, and I imagine very much like going to architecture school, like you're experiencing other people's perspectives, their foundations, their philosophies through what they create while also learning, which is truly unique, I think.
Yeah, a lot of personal expression. It's amazing. When I was at Columbia College, I was studying fine art, but only for a year and a half. So I didn't really get into like the really meaty stuff. I mean, I did a lot of 2D and 3D design and materials, and I did a lot of art history, but I was among the more conservative students there. It's a very broad, diverse community. Art, you just have people who are in for so many different reasons, and they are coming from very diverse backgrounds. And like you said, they're expressing it uniquely and in different ways. It's such a rich, robust community.
When I look at the rest of my career, like it laid such a great foundation for what you and I are talking about today, which is, what are the skills necessary, or what are interesting ways to find skills that transfer? Like for me, I still see myself every day, even in the very corporate setting that I'm in currently, as an artist, right? I'm thinking about what are my resources? What are my limitations? I think what the beauty is about art, and definitely when you design, spaces, is like, let your restrictions become benefits to you. How can you unlock potential by being restricted? Understanding the limited resources, understanding that as an artist and as a designer, like there is no end point, right? Like you have to say, I have to put this down, right? Because you can just keep doing it forever. You can, right? And so I think for me, like going to an art school, having a background in audio taught me that all of these things are restrictions and positives rather than limitations. And, you fail so often every day, but it doesn't feel like failing at all because you're doing something that there's a pursuit on the other end of that failure that's going to say, I'm going to look back on that and think, how did I even do that? How did I create such a thing that I now look back on? Well, it's because you failed a bunch. You were restricted. All these things that people take as I would say a limiting factor become a very freeing experience if you think about it from a creative standpoint. And for me, that's been the sauce, that's been the thing that's kept me going, I think, in a lot of ways.
I think everybody who's creating something, art or anything else, you want it to be the best that it can be. You want to create something that you're proud of and that that you pushed it as far as you can. That said, you can't start with that mentality or those goals, because if you try to perfect something on your first attempt, the task will be too daunting to even try, and you'll always push it off and never get there. Or you'll stop after the first attempt when it's not perfect. It doesn't come out exactly right the way that you had hoped for or envisioned. And maybe it's a turnoff. You're deterred from doing it again and trying other attempts. I guess the suggestion is to have different goals in your early attempts of trying something new or creating something, even if it's not new, but a new approach to something that you have done before. And to say, my goal is to get content out there. My goal is to get and produce something, to have something to show for the effort. And it's not going to be perfect or even great for that matter. My goal right now is to produce something.
Yeah.
And as you go along in those iterations, or maybe even over time, that you increase your goals, you push those goals and you say, okay, now I've done something. What's my next goal to improve on the qualitative results of that?
It's almost like in my mind, I think about it as being really tied down to the spirit of the outcome, what you want it to possibly be like, what are the attributes that you want it to have, but being very relaxed and flexible on how that outcome, one, comes about, but two, what it looks like at the end, right? Because if you approach the process with a certain level of openness, it's probably going to look a lot different than you ever imagined. But if the spirit of the thing still rings true to the attributes, what you wanted, content, you want it to be quality, you'll probably find a better outcome than you thought possible 9 times out of 10, which I think is beautiful. I think that keeps, again, that failure mentality kind of goes into the back of your head and you just say, I'm going to trust this process. Yeah.
Repeat that line. The spirit, what was it?
Yeah. The spirit of the outcome should be something you really attach to, whereas the outcome itself and how that spirit shows up or what the attributes of that outcome look like are different. Be loose about that, but be really strong on you want this to be a very broad thing. You want it to be of quality. You want it to be beautiful. You want it to be communicative, but be open to what it looks like at the end, right?
I love when somebody teaches me a new perspective on something. Even better if a good turn of phrase. That's going to rattle around in my brain for a while.
Oh,
The
good. I'm
spirit of the
glad.
outcome. That's a brilliant philosophy. I love that. The spirit of the outcome and everything supporting that. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
It's another way of saying, to some degree, it's the journey, not the destination.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a less cheesy way of saying that. Yeah. As you go through these doors in the process of building something, designing something, making something, things go wrong, things get set back, especially when you think about designing spaces like timelines, material availability, all those things change, right? So I think as you go through each stage of that, you have to adjust. And so if you're really tied to the outcome, I want it to look and feel exactly like this, and I'm not going to take any sacrifices,
Yeah.
Where are you at? You're just exhausting yourself, right? You're just limiting yourself from freely going about it, I think. Yeah.
You said earlier something that reminds me of one of the earliest principles that was taught to me. I think it was literally the first design class I ever had as a student in architecture by the first professor that ever talked to me. His name is Phil Camo. And Phil, if you're out there listening, I hope you're doing well. It's been a long time since I've seen you. He lives outside of Boston, Massachusetts. He made a big impression on me as a teacher in many different ways. One of the things that he said to me on that first class that I had about design is he equated it to duck shoving. He said, design is duck shoving. Why? If you ever see a gaggle of geese or ducks, you walk up to them. As you approach them, they don't really move unless you startle them or you push them. They'll move a little bit. They take a few steps, but they don't run away.
Yeah.
They're not as skittish. And so you walk up to them and you kind of shoo them, and then they move a little bit. And then you get closer and you shoo them again, and they move a little bit. And the same is with design. As you had mentioned earlier, that design can go on forever until you decide it's done. You have to say, this is good. I need to step back because I can spend an infinite amount of time trying to perfect it or add on to it. And part of that process to get there is you also have to keep pushing design. You have to keep pushing, otherwise it won't go anywhere like ducks. You got to keep pushing your design. You got to keep pushing your content. You got to keep pushing your artistic output, and whatever your artistic expression is, you have to keep pushing it for it to improve until you also say, that is good. That's where it needs to be. And I'm going to step away now.
Yeah. I think that's the hardest thing to do. If you think creatively and you work in what people would say is not a creative job, or if you think creatively and work a creative job, I think the hardest thing is to say, this is as good as I can get it. I'm okay with how people respond to it. I mean, design is an interesting one, right? Because in a lot of ways, the design process is the beginning of a long process to create, to build, right? And so you have to be comfortable with your portion being like, I've now set this in motion, right? I hope that the outcome meets my expectation, but I need to move on. And that's definitely the hardest thing to do, I think.
Speaking of moving on, you started off in audio engineering.
Yeah.
And where do you go from there? And tell me, if you don't mind, what led to looking for something different? And then where did you go?
Yeah. So while still working in live events, I spent about a decade after college working in operations. So managing the day-to-day of these businesses. A lot of them were AV providers in the city, which was amazing. I loved leading people and I loved managing warehouses, trucking, logistics, equipment. But I knew that the ceiling for what I could do in the industry was I was kind of meeting it. And so I wanted to do something different, right? I had a lot of friends who had very nice, interesting startup jobs or tech jobs or different knowledge-based work that wasn't as physically demanding. The timelines weren't as grueling. And so from there, I actually had an interesting opportunity where I moved into spice manufacturing. So food manufacturing.
Obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, right. And that was interesting for me. I think while I was doing operations management, I fell in love with two things that really helped, which was lean and the Toyota method of production. So understanding waste and efficiency and getting down to the attributes of that. And then I got my project management professional certification. Both of those were very hard transferable skills, right? Certifications, knowledge base stuff that really helped me move in from when you're thinking about live events, a lot of the stuff you're managing comes back to you. It's all short-term, long-term rentals. So the equipment you send out has to come back. And then you QC it, you store it, you bring it back, you put it on another show. But I wanted to get involved in something that was more, I guess, final in a way. You make a spice, you bottle it, you label it, you package it, it leaves your warehouse, right? And so I wanted to kind of challenge myself in the finality of that we had to be comfortable with what we were creating, but also me thinking operationally, how do we do this in an efficient and safe manner? So I moved into that next, which was very interesting. There's a lot of risk in making food or food adjacent things. So,
Oh, definitely. I'm curious, the risk on their part, you apply for this job, you're in an interview. What was that like where the hiring manager, the person that was interviewing you, is looking at your background and then essentially saying, yeah, I guess they can do this?
I feel like you would know this just as much as the next person, but luckily enough, the person who was the hiring manager was an amazing individual who was really open to whatever opportunity would fit this role. I served almost in like a chief of staff adjacent way, right? So she was the COO and I reported directly to her. And I would just get dispatched to different portions of the business to try to improve how they operated. And so when I was talking with her about that, I was very honest about like, this is what I see my future going into. Like, I want to take what I've learned about lean manufacturing, production, and take it into an area where I have a little bit more scope of control on improving things. And I think that just really connected. We were both pretty quickly over a phone call realized that like kindred spirits spoke the same language in a lot of ways. And so I think that was the value add for me, or that was at least something that really got me in the door.
So it sounds like she recognized, first of all, that you were interested earnestly. Sounds like she's risk tolerant. She wants to give somebody an opportunity to do something they've never done before, but it was because of both your background and you as a person that she had the confidence you could do this. And so she went on a limb and said, yeah, we'll figure this out together. Sounds like you want this job and I think you can do it. And so she made you an offer.
Yeah, 100%.
How many days into it until she regretted that decision?
You have to ask her. Shout out Jamie Shaw. I hope not. Yeah, no, I don't.
No, that's actually one of my KPIs or indicators of a good leader is somebody who is looking at the individual more than the resume. And both have their time and place and importance, especially in an interview. You're over the phone, you're talking, and this person's getting to know the candidate and asking enough questions to see how they think, but also how they approach problems and the type of person that they are, even like their sentiment and tone. Do they seem interested in wanting this job? Or is this just a job that they're applying for? They're not sure if they want it or not. So that interview is so important on so many levels, but the ones who do it well are the ones that are looking at the human being in front of them, vetting them as a strong candidate, but also as an individual who is growth minded and wants to learn the things that they don't know in order to get better at the job that they're being hired for.
Sensing in another person, I've hired a bunch of people over my career, sensing that person to a certain degree wants to get into this, like now, would love to start problem solving on this problem now and doesn't see it as just a transition, but sees it as an excitement, something they have curiosity about. Mm-hmm. I definitely think curiosity is probably the biggest, for me at least, has always been the biggest transferable or skill in general in life, is just being interested in as many things as possible all of the time, how things work, how they don't work. Yeah. And I think to that end, like I love hiring people who seem excited to solve the problem that the role presents. I think that's just, again, a spirit thing. You can't sense that on a resume. You have to understand that through them.
As you described, learning the skills needed for audio engineering, and then you talked about pursuing your project management certification and learning logistics and supply chain and all this stuff, and now moving into food adjacent and product and all that stuff. Curiosity was actually something, or maybe a byproduct. Curiosity is the byproduct of the question that I wanted to ask. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Through all those things, I'm curious what your approach is to resolving or exploring your curiosity. You've got the curiosity. How do you go about exploring, learning about, fulfilling the curiosity? And in that case, the same thing about the skills. I'm curious about an industry. I'm curious about a product. I'm curious about an idea, or I'm curious about how to do something. All of that is the same. It's the curiosity that leads towards the exploration and research. And so how are you learning these skills? By way of fulfilling your curiosity.
It's interesting. It's like two lanes merging for me. One, audio is interesting because 9 times out of 10, what you're doing is you're taking a source, so like a microphone, let's say, for example, and then you're running it through a ton of different things that eventually, which can be super complex or super minimal, to get to an outcome, whether it's a recording or a live reproduction in person. And each of those little steps manipulates the waveform, adjusts the gain structure, naturally. And you really have to compensate for that. You really have to understand each of these small building blocks, whether I'm compressing a signal, EQing a signal, limiting a signal, adding effects to signals, all of that changes the waveform. It changes the outcome. That's one. And then when I learned lean and the PMP, understanding that like improvement is an aggregate of small change over time, right?
Mm.
In order to make those small changes, you have to understand the small attributes that build up in a process. And so that's why I say it's a merging of highways, because audio taught me that from a signal flow standpoint. But lean and PMP taught me that from an operational standpoint, that all projects, all processes that you do every day are a buildup of small aggregate steps. So when I get curious about something, my first thought is like, what are these aggregate steps? What are the attributes of this thing from start to finish? And how can I understand those? I moved out of food manufacturing 3 years ago now. So now I work in an innovation practice as an operations and portfolio person, but it's still very much the same spirit of the thing, which is I'm constantly trying to understand the building blocks, how to make it go faster, how to increase quality, reduce waste. And it all comes down for me to exploring the incremental portions, the A to B, A to Z side of it.
Do you think that somebody could come to a rational conclusion that they can know the best method and outcome by sitting and thinking about it? Or do you think it typically requires hands-on prototyping?
It's a little bit of a mix of both for sure, but I think it's more so about hands-on prototyping or seeing somebody else do it, right? Understanding it, walking alongside someone who does the task if you're not that person, and say, what's your starting point? Like, break it down for me. You know, it's going to feel awkward because I'm asking you. They'll say like, oh, I screw this in. And I'm like, well, where do you get the drill from? Where do you get the bit from? Where do you get the screw from? I need to know the smallest detail, right? And so whether you're building the thing yourself and you're prototyping or you're watching someone else do it, I really think it takes experiencing it to a certain level to see it. I've made tons of decisions on improvement, especially earlier in my career, improvement initiatives without asking the user, without asking the end result person and thinking, wow, why did I think this was a good idea? Of course I did, because, you know, for me, I was sitting and I was thinking and I wasn't interacting.
Is there any more evident failure of any business or individual who is in a decision-making position than not interviewing stakeholders or consumers and users? It is such an underrated, necessary step of successful design.
Yeah.
You have to start with a theory. You have to then build on the theory with assumptions. But at some point, you need to prototype and you need to have the consumer feedback, because without it, you're shooting in the dark. You're making assumptions that sometimes are going to be accurate, and maybe that's just a coincidence, luck. It could be just intelligence that maybe you over-engineered the planning, and in which case the question is like, well, you probably could have spent half that amount of time and maybe cost if you talked to somebody before. But yeah, you can engineer it and think about it ahead of time. But I think you're right. I think sometimes it can be done on paper, but most of the time it's hands-on. When you describe this, do I need what kind of screwdriver or bit? What kind of tools do I need for this project? I see that come up so often in, let's call it just interior design. One of the things that I still find myself happily getting involved in is friends who are thinking about redesigning a room, remodeling, or just moving furniture around for that matter. They'll ask me for my opinion, and I'm happy to give it. It brings me joy, especially if I can use that part of my brain that I don't get to exercise often these days. So if I do that, I often see people who haven't gone through the experience, the user, let's call it workflow, but I'm not sure that there's an actual term for this, but I call it user experience, the walkthrough.
Mm-hmm.
When you're designing a kitchen, you need to know how the counters and cabinets is all laid out for efficiency. You don't want to have to constantly going back and forth for this one thing that are across the room from one another that you're always using at the same time. I think probably one of the most common issues is people did not think about outlets. You might find in a kitchen for that matter, or a bathroom, I put my coffee grinder right over here and there's no outlet there. And the outlet is just a couple feet over, but that's not where it's optimal for my coffee grinder to be. And the same thing when people don't put an outlet in the right place next to their sink in the bathroom. Well, where are you going to charge your shaver?
Yeah.
And so you have to think about, okay, go through the mental exercise if you can, and if not, find someone who can kind of imagine in a three-dimensional space in their head and say, okay, I do this, then what do I do? And then where do I go from there? And if you can go through that process, you can design something better than if you're just making assumptions without thinking about the walkthrough. And the same when it comes to product design at any level. I love that you said that, because I wasn't sure actually what the answer was when I asked the question. I think it's sort of a, it can go
Yeah.
either way. And I think you answered it, at least in a way that resonates well with me, is that yes, sometimes it can be this, but most of the time you got to talk to people. You got to go through that process and speak to people who use it or are going to use it. And when you're designing something, you got to see, where's that joint going to be? Is it beneficial to paint it ahead of time or not? What's it going to look like afterwards? How hard is that going to be? That's the point of prototyping. Prototyping is testing and playing until you figure it out.
You and I have never talked about this, but I am a deep enthusiast, I'd say now, of architecture and design. It's a huge hobby interest of mine. And I think that's a perfect example of like, you're designing lived spaces, right? And so there's a relationship between what you're doing and people. It's just like much like stand-up comedy, right? Like as a comedian, you need energy from the crowd it's a give and take. It's just the same with producing a thing, building an app. There's two players involved. And so if you're only thinking about the design of the thing, you're really heavily discounting the relationship, the back and forth that you need. I mean, you're only one person, right? And so why wouldn't you ask other opinions of people who would be interested and eager to engage with what you've made? You're really discounting the potential of what it could be and also missing the mark 9 times out of 10, right?
I'm curious why people don't ask for other opinions. There's no objective answers. Is it out of laziness? Is it pride? Is it just time saving? I don't know why. It's more work.
Yeah. Maybe a little bit more ego involved, or some people are just very passionate, especially if they're a founder or a designer of the thing. And they're like, I know exactly how this should be. And I know how people should interact with it. And I have confirmation bias in my head that people are just going to absolutely love the thing that I know isn't a preference, but it's a mandatory thing. I think, people just get in the way of that.
You can be an artist or an engineer of any sort. You're a creator. And I think the problem with being a creator is the God complex. It's like, I'm creating something that didn't exist before. And this is my vision. And you're not wrong. You want to have your brand, your stamp on it. You want it to come from you. And sometimes the best innovation is because it didn't exist before. People didn't have the imagination that this could be this iPod, right, that I'm holding. This iPod didn't exist before. The possibility of it wasn't really conceivable before. And so, yes, that's the most meaningful innovations, because the designers of the iPod, the entire teams, it wasn't one person, the entire team of people that created that technology influenced an entire generation of listeners in a new, meaningful way. If they went out and asked a consumer for their feedback on what would you like and what would you want, they would probably say something along the lines of, well, I'd like an easier way to carry more CDs in my pocket.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the solution. The foundation of that, the content of the CDs is the solution. I want more in my pocket, but it's not a better version of what we already have. It's a new version of something that didn't exist before. So I think that there is a God complex there, and people have pride, and maybe there's ego. And I think there's a little bit of laziness there too.
Yeah.
It's more work.
I think about the successes of transferring in business, like history. Like I think about Fuji film when they saw that, the end was coming, that the digital camera was going to take over. Like
Kodak died because they didn't have the confidence to pivot from a proven revenue-driven model. It was successful for generations past. So why would we abandon this? I have seen this personally. And when you're not thinking innovative, if you're not thinking about tomorrow, forget about today. Today is a little bit late. If you're not thinking about tomorrow, then you're already antiquating your business model. So Kodak didn't see that, and they're course correcting right now in new ways, which is fun and interesting and nostalgic ways. Konica Minolta did the same thing. They realized that the quality of their camera sensors just weren't up to par, and they weren't competing any longer for the same price point buyers as Canon, as Nikon. And so they abandoned, I don't know, maybe it was like the early aughts, they abandoned their cameras and they went back to just saying, we're doing printers only. And so if you're not innovating, you're falling behind. And if you're not going to take a chance and say, I know we have a successful business model, but what else is possible? Or what are people doing differently today that we have to start planning for in the future? You're 100% correct.
So I'm pursuing my MBA right now. And last semester I had an entrepreneurship professor who, and I'm going to get this wrong a little bit because the analogy essentially is you can pivot, but once you start pivoting too much, you're circling the drain, right? You're downward spiraling. So pivot, sure, but don't downward spiral, right? Don't constantly think that you need to reinvent the wheel, but try to be intelligent, ask other people's opinions, get feedback, be intelligent about it, be strategic about it.
Can you talk more about that? Like, this was probably a long lecture or reading assignment, but Can you synthesize more definition of what that looks like? What is like the difference between a bad pivot and a good pivot?
Yeah, I think the spirit of the thing or the lesson was essentially, as entrepreneurs or founders, right? You really want what you are excited about to be successful. And it is very easy to get stuck in, let's say sunk cost adjacent fallacy of, well, if I just keep changing, if I keep shifting, eventually I'll unlock the success of it, right? And essentially realizing like you can pivot what you're doing, especially in a startup phase, especially if it's just you doing it. But the more you pivot, the more you dilute that initial idea and the success of the initial idea. And sometimes you just got to back up completely and say, hey, I got to go back to the drawing board and try to figure out a different way to make something work. This might not be it. And so I think that was the lesson. It's like, don't get hung up on trying to make an idea work after a few times. Maybe it's just not meant to be. Maybe you need to shelf it and come back to it when you've learned something or experienced something where you're like, like that's the thing,
That's a great understanding. Looking at the past roles that you've had, it doesn't really matter which ones, and you can go through them if you'd like. What skills from your past have made you or helped make you more successful in what you do today?
First and foremost, as mentioned, understanding the building blocks of how things get done is definitely one of them. But also, I currently work in professional services, so tax audit consulting firms. There's a really tight box around shared verbiage, knowledge, communication. A lot of the people that I interact with professionally on a day-to-day basis have either worked at our firm for a very long time, or their lived experience professionally is at competitors of our firm, right? They've been in that industry and they'll stay into it. It's a very homogenous space where most people stick around, And so with that, in any case, there's a shared language, there's a shared understanding around terminology and verbiage. And so for me, something that helped when I moved from audio into spice manufacturing was understanding that they might sound different. There's a lot of terms you use that might be different, but that I could pull analogs from my former experience to say, for that transition, it was thinking about manufacturing waste, right? Like what doesn't work out? What material do we have to throw out afterwards is the same as when equipment comes back from a live event and cables are damaged and torn. Like, how do we allocate for that issue? How do we make sure that our accounting department knows that that depreciation needs to stop on that asset and that it's done, right? So for me, understanding, waste is just the same as an audio console that comes back waterboarded and destroyed because it was out in the rain. Cool. Okay, perfect. So then when I moved into professional services, I looked for analogs there of like, what is the waste here? A waste is time, where we're thinking about not digital knowledge work. People are behind laptops, doing meetings, doing spreadsheets, PowerPoints. Time is the waste. Okay, cool. So I can speak to properly resourcing our enterprise assets, right? And our human capital, right? I can speak to that because to me, it's the same as waste in manufacturing, same as waste in live events. It's all waste. It just sounds differently. And I think it's interesting. I gravitate towards people who don't put too much stock in language being exact, but being in the spirit of that language, especially in interview situations, right? A lot of people that I've experienced at specific jobs that I've interviewed for have tried to see and kind of gauge, do I understand the shared language? And personally, I don't think that that's important. I don't think it's important to be exact in the words you use, but it's really important to make sure that that person can understand this is a required thing that you'll be asked to do every day. Do you understand from your past experience an analog, a similarity? Can you speak to that rather than can you exactly tell me in our shared language that we love in this camp what that is? And I want to make sure word for word you nail it, right? I think some people put too much stock in that. So for me, understanding that I can do the translation and I need to do the translation. People say it all the time when you try to get a new job or when you're interviewing, like, it's up to you as the candidate to tell the story, especially if you're transferring, especially if your resume doesn't match, what they're looking for exactly. It's like, it's up to you to bridge that gap with your words and with your tone and with your experience. And so I knew it was up to me to translate, but I knew that I was capable of it because we all like to believe that everything we do professionally is super particular to us. Like no one does what I do. But at the end of the day, like if you really break it down, a lot of us do the same thing. They just look different, sound different. The risk is different. And so I think for me, like something that's definitely helped me in every transfer of industry that I've had is like understanding how I can translate.
Do you have a hack, a pro tip for anyone who is switching industries and careers. They're getting into something completely different. And then there's industry jargon. There is industry terms, even maybe ones that are specific to that company. They've got their abbreviations. They've got their terms. Do you have a pro tip or a hack of how you get up to speed with some of that literal language?
You really have to realize that you're entering a space where everyone else is comfortable with that term and those terminologies, and you're the new one. And so it's safe to ask the question, what do we mean when we say that? What is that acronym specifically? It takes a lot of vulnerability, but I think it's as simple as being curious again on saying like, I need to figure this out.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to figure out the first time I hear it mentioned and the second time, the third time I realize it's a trend, I need to stop and say, hey, find people you're comfortable with, sure, right? You don't want to make yourself look bad in a situation, but maybe you do. Maybe you want to lean into the vulnerability of saying, I don't know what that means. Can you tell me? If you still don't understand, ask follow-up questions until you're like, oh, I think I have an idea of what you're talking about. I think that's like the first step.
That's really helpful. So from the individual standpoint, it's asking the questions, be vulnerable, say, I don't know. What does this mean? I think that's really important. It's overlooked a lot. I think it's a vulnerability thing, as you mentioned. People are afraid to appear ignorant. And one of the things I have said several times is, especially if you're a leader, by the way, it's okay and maybe important for you to appear to be the dumb one, to be the sacrificial lamb, to be the one that says, hey, I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about. I'm a little lost. Help me understand this. What does this mean? I'm not sure I'm following it completely. So that's the first thing. And from the company standpoint, one of the things that I had noticed in an advisory role that I was doing recently for a company that was starting up, and they've been around for a little bit, but they're still in the early stages. I noticed in 2 or 3 meetings that I had with them, they had used 3 or 4 different terms for the exact same definition. They kept using 3 or 4 different terms interchangeably. And in some cases, yes, you could use a couple different ones if they mean something different, but it's important for companies to get on the same page and make decisions, which can be hard to say, from now on, we are calling this. We're using this term to define this or to represent this, because you want to start creating a lexicon, a collection of words and terms and phrases that have very specific meanings and that everyone's on the same page. So that's really great, helpful information is be vulnerable, listen a lot, and ask the right questions.
Yeah, and I think from the company standpoint or the culture of the company is to not overuse terms where a better opportunity is available that's simpler for most people. I probably, just like most people, I have my pet peeve words at work, things where I'm just like, wait, why are we saying that?
Right.
Any job I've ever had. And I think about ones like enterprise, where you could easily just say, okay, across the board, we should be doing this, right? Like you could say, Noah, you could speak as yourself, like from my perspective. And it's like, well, of course it's from your perspective. You're talking. I understand that that's what you're concerned about. You're our head of legal. So I can then infer that it is from a legal perspective that you bring this up. And so I really do think that from the business culture perspective and leaders, we need to be better at saying, hey, let's just break through that and speak simply as when we can, and be really strong about when we need to all speak the same language, let's go for it. But if it's just a common conversation, let's not use that lexicon. Let's speak simply. Let's not waste the time and energy confusion. Let's be clear. Yeah, I think you really, as a company culture, you really need to determine when you need to turn it on and turn it off.
And be relatable.
Yeah, 100%.
One of the things that didn't hurt my feelings, but it gave me pause, was one time somebody who reported up to me told me that somebody on their team had been wanting to talk to me about something and they've been putting it off. And I'm like, why? And they said, well, they're a little intimidated. I said, why? What am I doing? What kind of behavior am I exhibiting that's making them intimidated? And they said, it's just your position in the company. It's what you represent and who you are. And I realized in that moment, I can do my best to try to be relatable, to recognize that, humble myself and allow everyone to humble themselves to be on the same playing field, because that's, I believe, very important. That's teamwork. But ultimately, there's going to be perception. And what can I do to try to make myself appear more approachable? I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I recognize that everybody's going to have some of their insecurities, vulnerabilities, and sensitivities. And I need to also be sensitive to those and make sure that what I'm doing is creating an environment to the best of my ability that lets them know that my door is always open and that all their colleagues are available to them at their discretion when they need for support in any which way. That was a good moment where I was able to recognize that it's not as perfect as I like to think in my head. And I need to work harder on making it known that I'm here for you. You're not here for me. I'm here for you.
Yeah. And there's some obstacles, right? Especially in your position in that scenario that you can't overcome by just being a different version of yourself. Like you can't overcome that you're an executive leader of the team, because at the end of the day, you are. And so it's like, how far can you exhibit your true self and humility and engagement with others? It's like, there's still going to be a few people that are still tripped up on the fact that you represent something that's a little different. Yeah.
It's a character. It's a position. It's that there's a symbology behind the title or longevity and history with the company. But you said it earlier very well. You got to know when to turn it on and lean into it. There's time and place for every single thing. The way that one behaves in a one-on-one might be different than how you behave in a small group at a meeting, which might be very different than how you present yourself in a company-wide fireside chat kind of thing, or even in media, in public settings. I've been in those positions, and yeah, you got to turn it on then, because you represent the brand, which represents something much bigger than just you.
And understanding your audience, right? Like, who is your audience? What is their expectations? What is your expectations of how you want to perform in that space and show up? And how is that different from time to time? I mean, you nailed it. Yeah.
By the way, not to be confused with authenticity. Those all should be displayed in different ways, but with a foundation of authenticity.
Yeah.
Just because you are saying, behaving, acting, or presenting slightly differently in different scenarios doesn't mean that any one of those is not who you are. It's just who you are in this moment, in this setting and context.
Which has an upper threshold and a lower threshold, right? And that is where the authenticity comes in. It's like, you're not being someone different. You're being your true self, but just in a different way.
Well, this has been fantastic. A true pleasure, Keith. I loved having you on the show. I love talking about things. You have a very diverse background. What you're doing now is completely different than how you started your career. That is inspiration to me. It's exciting to me. Thank you for giving us that journey and specificity of the skills and applications. Thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, thank you, Noah, for everything. And transferable skills in general is something I'm interested in and talking about. So this is a joy for me. Thank you.
You're not just interested in it, you're living it. You're doing it.
Yeah.
Walking the walk, man.
Walking the walk. Love it.
All right.
Thank you.
I want to thank Jacqueline Crawford for recommending Keith as today's guest, and to you, our listeners, for joining us on this episode of Transferable Skills. Remember, if you found value in today's episode, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share it with your friends and network. Your support helps us reach more people who could benefit from these stories. Transferable Skills is produced by Cackle Media and music by Cosmonkey. Our editor for this episode was Aaron Wertheimer. For more resources and inspiration on leveraging your skills for a successful career transition, visit our website at cacklemedia.com. Follow us on social platforms at cacklemedia for updates, and join our community of listeners who are all about embracing change and growth. If you have any questions, feedback, or want to share your own career pivot story, email us at skills@cacklemedia.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening, and remember, the skills you've gained can take you anywhere. Until next time, keep exploring those transferable skills.